Hey everyone! Thanks for joining me to learn how I made my vampire costume. We have a lot to do, so let's jump in. Before we do any cutting, we need to pick a pattern and take our measurements. Each pattern will have a size marking on it somewhere. To get the right size, you'll need your measurements. These are listed usually on the back of the pattern. These measurements will line up with a sizing chart, usually below. Without these measurements, it's hard to get the right size. More often than not, the measurements will be in inches. For the bust, measure across the center of your chest, not below, not above, center. Waist is the smallest point between your bust and hips. Hips should be measured where they are widest to ensure a good fit. Finally, back neck to waist follows your spine to your waist measurement from earlier. Looking inside, you'll see two different papers. The first we're looking at is the instruction sheet. This leads you through your sewing as you go. It even includes cutting layouts to help make the most of your fabric. Each layout will tell you what pattern pieces it's working with. You'll need this the whole time. Next are the actual pattern pieces. You'll need to open these up first. Go slow so they don't tear. Each piece will have a number and name and say how many need to be cut. Some will have closely stacked lines. These are the different sizes. Make sure you follow the right line. Now, let's start cutting. This will take a while depending on how intricate your pattern is. Sometimes it looks worse than it is though. For example, the pattern I chose has duplicate pieces. Why? Well, they divided up the available sizes, so I'll only need to cut the one I need. Once the pieces are cut, I sort them out by what type they are, interfacing, fabric, or lining. Some fit multiple categories. Make sure you keep track of them. Next, I cut my interfacing. These pieces give parts of the costume more structure to better hold their shape and go between the fabric and the lining. Next, I cut these out following my chalk lines. Some pattern pieces might have markings on them. Add these marks to your fabric. Where there are triangles, cut a notch into your fabric. This is important later on. From there, it's on to the cape. I lined the scalloped edge of the lace up with the bottom of the pattern. That made laying the rest of it out a little interesting. Once it's in place, you're ready to cut. Follow the edge of the pattern. I chose to use the cut lace instead of the pattern for the rest of the pieces to line things up more easily. This isn't something you have to do, I just found it easier. Cut pieces out until you have the number you need, stated on the pattern piece. Next, onto the cape collar. Fabric has a right side, the side you want shown, and a wrong side, the side you won't see. Make sure you know which is which. For the collar, I folded my fabric in half before pinning and cutting. This makes my two pieces match much better at the end. Once those are marked, I set them aside. Next come the petals of the overskirt. there's a lot to cut here. Cut it out carefully, like for the cape, and be sure to keep count. With the final petal cut, we're on to the skirt. This pattern uses a gathered skirt, so we start by cutting out a huge rectangle. The size is written in the instructions. Repeat this for the skirt lining. I like to label my pieces to avoid confusion later. Now onto the corset top. This has a lot of pieces, so labeling is super helpful here. And don't forget to mark your fabric as you go, and mark on the fabric's wrong side. Now we're ready to start sewing. First up is the cape. I started by gathering the top edges to make it look smaller, and did this with all 4 pieces. Then I prepared the cape collar by attaching the interfacing. It needs to be ironed on. Make sure your iron isn't too hot for the fabric you're using. Some fabrics react badly to high heat. Once that's applied, I can attach the lining. Do this inside out to hide the main seam at the top. I find it helpful to mark the seam allowance to keep me on track. Once that's ready, you can start stitching. I did this by hand because of the rounded corners, but a machine will work fine, just go slowly. Don't forget to secure your ends to keep threads from pulling loose. Reattach any pieces of the interfacing that may be a little loose. With rounded edges, you'll want to cut a few notches into the seam, but not past the thread. This makes it easier to turn inside out. Before that, though, I need to attach the lace to the collar. I do this following the marks from the pattern. Now, I stitch the lace in place, only going through one layer of the collar. Again, I've chosen to do this by hand. Lace and machines don't always get along. With those in place, I flip the collar inside out to hide all the seams. I pin it down before pressing it to make sure everything stays in place. The iron will help the collar to stay stiffer. Once it's pressed, I close off the bottom of the collar. Now, onto the closure. For this, I'm using an old necklace. First, I have to cut the chain to the right length. From there, I put the pendant back on and close it with a small jump ring. Then I add 2 larger rings to the ends, the chain roughly folded in half, so the pendant still hangs down. Before I can add it to the cape, though, I'll need to add some clasps first. Position the clasp, then stitch tightly around it. You'll want to go through the center of the opening and over until it feels secure. Repeat on the other side. Now you can attach your chain. Last but not least, you'll need to attach your cape edges following the instructions. Moving on to the overskirt. We'll start by applying the interfacing to the waistband. With that prepped, we'll move on to the petals. Line the small petals up as shown in the instructions. Now it's time to gather them all together. Keep it loose enough to be able to adjust as you go. Line the petals up on the waistband, following the instructions. Pin in place and adjust as needed while you work. Once placed, stitch it down. Repeat this for the next 2 layers of petals. With all the layers in place, it's time to fold the material slightly so the layers will end up inside the waistband and unseen. Stitch that in place. Fold a small seam at the top too, to clean up the edges. Stitch that down. Fold the waistband in half with right sides together and stitch just the ends shut, shortways. Cut off the top corners to make it easier to turn inside out. Once flipped, pin and press the waistband. Then stitch along the open bottom edge. Next come grommets. Follow your instructions that come with the tool. Make a hole. Put the grommet pieces in place. And hammer them together. This part is noisy. Next up is the skirt. Like before, start by applying the interfacing to the waistband. Next, gather the skirt. Make sure you have marked the center front. Match the center front mark of the skirt to the center front mark on the waistband. Do this with right sides together. Pin the rest in place, adjusting gathers as you go. Pin the back seam of the skirt together, leaving an opening at the top for the zipper later. Time to stitch. This is quick on a machine. You'll need to make sure it's properly threaded first. Make sure the machine foot is down before you push down on the pedal. Go a bit in reverse at the ends to seal the stitch. Now, stitch at the waistband. I did this by hand because the gathers were too thick for the machine. Repeat with the skirt lining, pinning it to the free edge of the waistband. It will look like a long tube at first. Once attached, flip it so the right side of the skirt is showing and the waistband is in half. Press the waistband to help it keep its shape. Pin the opening for the zipper to clean the edges up. Stitch those edges down. This is not the usual way to do zippers, it's just how I did it. Then, stitch down the waistband along the bottom edge. When adding the zipper, I lined the top up just below the waistband and pinned it in place. Then, I carefully stitched the zipper in. This zipper was too big, so I had to cut it short. Next, add a hook and eye clasp at the top of the waistband. Make sure they line up the way you want. With the corset, we once again start by applying interfacing. Now those notches from before come in handy. Match them up as you pin pieces in place. Now it's time to sew. Rounded corners require more care. I use the hand crank on the side of the machine to give me more control. Repeat with the other half of the corset. Attach the two halves in the center. Once assembled, press the seams flat. This takes some time. Take featherweight boning and line the seams with it. Center it as best you can. This is easiest if you cut the length and then remove the solid piece from the casing. Stitch the casing down, following the edge seams of the casing. Round the edges of the boning to avoid snagging. Carefully slip it back into the casing and seal the end. Repeat with the remaining seams. Prep the corset lining following the same process as the corset itself. With right sides together, pin the corset to the lining. Stitch the side seams and upper edge. Turn the corset right side out, flattening the seams out. Pin in place and press to help it lay flatter. Stitch along the outside edges to finish. On the sides, stitch a channel through both layers to hold a strip of boning. Make sure it's wide enough. Create holes where you have marked your fabric for grommets. Do the same thing as for the overskirt. Next, prepare the back panel with interfacing. Attach the lining right sides together. Sew every edge shut, leaving a gap on one side. Through this gap, turn the panel right side out. You may need a tool to help with the corners. Then, seal the open edge, pressing the seam inside for a smooth finish, and press it flat. Attach it to only one side of the corset lining, overlapping the backs of the grommets. Be careful not to hit the grommets as you stitch. Finally, add your lacing. Our final step is to make a matching mask. First, find a pattern for a style you like. My pattern needs 4 pieces cut. From there, I attach 2 with right sides together and repeat that with the other pair. Stitch along the rounded edge. Now I pin the halves together, seams together. Stitch near the top of the fabric. Finish the edges of the mask using ribbon or bias tape. I start with the sides, folding the ribbon in half over the edge. Next, I line the bottom edge. Leave some extra to form little loops. Last, line the top. Leave a lot of extra trailing off to make your ties. Pull the tails through the loops you made and knot the ends. Thanks for watching! Join me for a live Zoom Q&A on March 25th with any questions you might have.